It was a sound that defined the war, a deep, steady thunder that rolled across Europe. Hundreds of engines beating together, shaking the morning sky. The men inside those aircraft, young, pale, and quiet, sat strapped into metal coffins flying at 25,000 feet. They called them fortresses, but the truth was crueler. These planes were fortresses made of aluminum barely thicker than a coin. The air outside was 40 below zero. The smell of oil, sweat, and cordite clung to every surface. And beneath them waited an enemy they couldn't see. Black clouds began to bloom in the distance. Each one marked the explosion of a flak shell, steel fragments shredding the air. For every man watching, that sight meant only one thing. They'd been found. The order went out over the intercom. Bomb bay doors open. And with that command, the aircraft's fate was sealed. Because from that moment on, every plane in the formation had to fly straight and level. No evasive turns, no sudden dives, no breaks in formation. They were locked on rails, moving in a straight line through a sky that wanted them dead. German gunners on the ground didn't need to aim anymore. They simply filled that straight line with timed explosions. It was math. Cold, merciless, mechanical math. The enemy knew the bomber's altitude. They knew their speed. And with instruments and experience, they could predict exactly where those bombers would be when the bombs fell. They didn't have to hit a specific plane. They just had to turn that patch of sky into a killing zone. And for months, that strategy worked. Entire crews vanished without leaving a trace. Flak batteries outside cities like Hamburg, Schweinfurt, and Merseburg became infamous, names whispered by airmen like curses. Every bomber crew knew the same truth. You could be perfect at your job, hit every mark, and still not make it home. And so, somewhere between desperation and ingenuity, a new idea began to take shape. A secret so simple, yet so daring, that it broke every rule of doctrine ever written. It was a move born not from a manual, but from instinct. A way to cheat the enemy's math, to throw off the deadly precision of flak gunners by breaking predictability itself. They called it the roll drop. It started quietly, a handful of pilots in the 8th Air Force trying something different on the bomb run. As the lead bombardier called steady and the formation prepared to drop, a few captains gave their planes a subtle tilt. Not a full roll, just enough to shift the aircraft's attitude by a few degrees. To the crews, it barely felt like anything. But to the bombs leaving the bay, everything changed. By the laws of physics, a bomb keeps the momentum of the aircraft that leaves. Tilt the plane, even slightly, and that momentum shifts. The bombs now travel with a slightly different horizontal vector, just enough to change their path through the air. And that small change, a fraction of a second in timing, a handful of yards in trajectory, was enough to ruin the flak gunner's perfect math. Shells that should have exploded right in the middle of the formation now burst harmlessly behind or ahead. The roll drop didn't make bombers invincible, but it made them unpredictable. And unpredictability, in a sky ruled by machines and mathematics, was power. At first, no one wrote it down. No one wanted to admit they'd broken formation protocol, a punishable offense if an officer caught you doing it. But when crews came back from missions and said, flak was lighter this time, people started listening. The reports were scattered at first. Pilot banked during release. Observed bursts late. Lead rolled slightly. Fewer hits recorded. But pattern by pattern, mission by mission, the evidence grew. Something was happening up there. Something that couldn't be explained by luck alone. The engineers on the ground began running calculations. Could a controlled roll actually shift the bomb pattern enough to throw off flak? Could the change in airflow and release angle alter the path just enough to make a difference? The answer was yes. Even a tiny change in the bomber's attitude, 2 or 3 degrees, meant the bombs would leave the bay at a slightly different speed or angle. That altered the bomb's ground track by tens of meters. And if the enemy's flak was timed for one altitude or one coordinate, that minor deviation could push the bombs and the bomber out of the kill zone. It wasn't magic. It was physics. But in war, physics could save your life. And as more crews began experimenting, the roll drop evolved from rumor into ritual. Pilots whispered about it in mess halls. Bombardiers taught it to each other over mission maps, tracing the motion of the roll with a pencil on the table. They didn't write it in reports. They didn't brief it before missions. They just did it. It became a secret language in the sky, passed from one man to another, flight by flight, without ever being officially sanctioned. The commanders might have called it reckless. But for the men flying through Flak over Germany, it was the first thing that made them feel like they had a say in their own survival. They learned to hate the last minute. It was the only minute in the mission when every decision felt final, when training and machine and human were all met under the most unforgiving conditions. In the cold, thin air above enemy territory, with the ground a small and distant theater of light and shadow, crews quieted into the geometry of the bomb run. Engines hummed in an almost religious monotone. Men breathed through oxygen masks and watch dials. The Norden bomb site blinked in its housing like an altar. The formation closed ranks. Precision demanded obedience. Fly straight, keep trim, hold heading. Let the lead bombardier set the moment when iron would fall. If doctrine made the bomber predictable, the defenders built their vengeance on that predictability. Anti-aircraft batteries were instruments of timing. They learned how to turn a corridor of sky into a deadly lattice by layering bursts at fixed ranges and altitudes. They did not always aim to blow aircraft out of the sky with single, precise hits. They preferred to carve the air into a trap. Shells were fused to go off at calculated heights. Rangefinders measured distance. Predictors, mechanical, optical, human, computed the moment when metal and men would pass through a given cube of air and detonated the curtain accordingly. When a bomber formation obeyed the rules of its site and its training, it also obeyed the arithmetic the defenders used to kill it. So the roll drop started as a question more than an invention. What happens if we break the one rule that made us mathematically traceable? What could a single small alteration, a controlled roll in the instant of release, do to the carefully timed cubes of bursting metal that had cost so many lives? It was not a command from high. It was a whisper in the mess hall and a pencil line across a map table. It was a flight engineer's curiosity and a captain's quiet willingness to try something that was, on paper, reckless. Mechanically, the idea is arrestingly simple. A bomb, once released, retains the horizontal velocity of the aircraft at the moment of separation. Anything that changes that initial velocity vector, a change in pitch, in yaw, or in roll, changes where the bomb will go. A roll is a rotation about the longitudinal axis. Tilt the aircraft a few degrees at the instant of release, and the bombs leave with a slightly different horizontal component. Aerodynamic forces interacting with the bomb at the moment it leaves the bay are also altered by that rotation. A carefully timed incremental bank can nudge the bomb's path by tens of yards, perhaps more depending on altitude, airspeed, and the specifics of release. 2 seconds of difference in when a shell detonates relative to when a bomb passes through is enough to turn a lethal bloom into an empty sky. The roll drop was not about chaos. It was an exercise in marginal arithmetic pushed into life or death stakes. The men who used it learned that success depended on precision of a different kind. Precise timing of a roll, precise control of bank angle, and an almost intimate sense between pilot and bombardier of when the altered geometry would offset the barrage. In practice, it required 3 things that were hard to achieve under fire. First, the pilot had to commit to a controlled roll that would not upset the formation or the aerodynamic integrity of the aircraft. Second, the bombardier had to be ready to release in an altered attitude and to interpret what that meant for his site. Some found they had to make small compensations in their calculations. Others trusted feel. Third, the rest of the box had to accept a small deviation by one element without suddenly scrambling the whole formation into disorder. That last point was the greatest taboo of all. Bomber doctrine prized uniformity because a broken formation invited fighters and collisions. To defy that was, in the minds of many commanders, to gamble irresponsibly. Yet life and doctrine diverged, often in wartime. In the cramped world behind plexiglass domes and under ice-slick metal skins, men made choices that their manuals never authorized. The early roll drops were improvisations. A pilot testing a bank on a practice run, a bombardier's note in a log, an engineer's small device painted and bolted near the bomb site to register roll angle at release. Word-of-mouth teaching spread across squadrons. If you are at altitude X and speed Y and the fuses are set to Z, try a 3-degree roll to the right at release. The phrase try is important. This was not doctrinal certainty. It was iterative, empirical, and born of survival instinct. Understanding why it could work requires drilling into the defender's methods. Flak batteries were not perfect. They were constrained by sensor precision, fuse technology, and human reaction. The German approach often involved dialing in a barrage to cover the most probable passage of the formation through the kill volume. That meant fuses would be set to detonate at times or altitudes based on predicted arrival, rather than relying solely on individual tracking. The predictors were excellent at their math, so long as the variables remained steady, but the system had latency, instruments that fed information predictors, gunners who adjusted to visual cues, and shells that had inherent time delays and dispersion. The roll drop's effectiveness exploited that latency. By changing the exact coordinates and timing of where bombs separated from the aircraft, bombers could thread a needle between time bursts. This explains the paradox. A maneuver that seems to make bombs less accurate could, under the right circumstances, increase mission effectiveness by trading small target displacement for survivability. For some targets, the difference between a bomb landing in the factory yard and landing on the assembly line meant the difference between halting production and merely damaging an outbuilding. Commanders obsessed with kill counts and pinpoint hits worried about creep back and pattern spread. Crews using roll drop accepted some variability in pure accuracy in exchange for a higher probability of getting significant ordnance into the general target area and, crucially, getting their crew home. Not all missions were suited for it. Low-altitude attacks had different constraints. Night raids and Pathfinder-led operations had their own methodologies. Roll drop made the most sense during daylight precision raids at medium to high altitude, where the enemy had pre-planned barges set against the expected geometry of the formation. It also mattered most when the bomber was under concentrated anti-aircraft fire from fixed defenses as opposed to mobile, reactive artillery. The technique had to be calibrated to enemy fuse settings, time fuses versus proximity or barometric fuses, and those settings could change from sector to sector. The roll drop was a tool in a toolbox, not a universal solution. The operational history of the roll drop is one of concealment and survival. It was rarely admitted in official debriefings, because to do so would be to confess a deviation from orders. Yet mission logs and oral histories, when read with attention and skepticism, reveal the pattern. Crews returning from missions over ball-bearing works in Schweinfurt or oil plants around Merseburg sometimes noted anomalies in flak timing, where that burst seemed to come late. Engineers recorded small experiments in aerodynamics. Pilots told stories of easing their controls in the seconds before release and seeing the entire sky alter as shells that might have shredded their wings exploded harmlessly in the air they had just left. These were not headline-making tactics. They were survival trades whispered over beer and cigarette smoke, passed from one flight to the next. There is a human dimension that is easy to lose in technical description. Imagine a bombardier hunched beneath frost and glass, his world focused on a tiny strip of horizon, sweating under gloves as his hands move dials. He knows the training. He knows that deviation could spread bombs across a whole neighborhood rather than concentrating damage where planners want it. He also knows that the cost of following doctrine could be his crew. The roll drop became, for many, an ethical calculation played out in seconds, accuracy in service of strategic goals, or small manipulation that might save lives at the cost of a little accuracy. No one made that decision lightly. Where the commanders had planners to answer to, crews had sons and brothers waiting for letters and one more leave. Wartime moral calculus is brutal. Their choice is understandable to anyone who has stared down impending death and sought any possible lever to change it. Training for roll drop never became institutional. That was partly tactical prudence. Permission could have required formal study, which would compromise the secrecy and spontaneity of the technique, and partly because higher command did not want deviation. In rare cases, officers sanctioned trials and controlled exercises, often under the rubric of improvised evasive measures, but the informal spread was the real channel. As crews gained experience, they developed heuristics. The amount of roll, the direction to bank, adjustments for wind and ground speed, and how to brief the rest of the formation without alarming the brass. Some pilots preferred a right roll, others a left, depending on target orientation and approach corridor. Bombardiers learned to anticipate the altered view through the sight. Some modified their release timing to account for the bank-induced vector changes. Moments of dramatic success entered into squadron lore. A mission over a heavily defended industrial complex might have seen a lead element make a coordinated roll drop and report fewer casualties and more bombs landing in the desired sector than expected. Word of such missions traveled fast. It is crucial to be careful in telling these stories. The tendency of memory is to seed pattern where there may be noise. Survivors embellish. The human mind weaves narratives of cause and effect because meaning helps endure trauma. Yet the accumulation of such accounts cannot be dismissed. Where noise becomes repeated observation across units and time, a plausible explanation exists for the technique's emergence and persistence. Opponents noticed too. German gunners, efficient and adaptive, began to see that something had altered the effective accuracy of their barges. Commanders and artillery analysts debated explanations. Were the Americans adjusting altitude? Were they changing speed? Were new navigational aids confusing range calculations? A roll drop is, by design, subtle. Its hallmark is that it fools a statistical system that expects conformity. That fooling leaves little obvious evidence on the ground. For defenders, an occasional drop in successful burst alignment could be put down to range error, wind, or crew fatigue. However, as more bomber groups experimented, local patterns of unexplained mistiming started to crop up in intelligence reports. Some German logs noted that barges were failing to connect with their intended center mass. That was not the same as recognizing a specific tactic, but it indicates the broader strategic effect. Unpredictability creates confusion in the enemy chain. The tactical case studies are instructive. In raids where flak was dense and concentrated, the roll drop's marginal increases in survivability could translate to fewer aircraft lost in a sortie and a higher number returning to fight another day. At strategic levels, these survival gains matter. Air power is not measured only by bombs dropped, but by the continuity of force, trained crews, and airframes available for subsequent missions. When a technique reduces attrition without dramatically sacrificing destructive capability, it alters campaign calculus. Commanders who saw that their groups returned more intact could press harder on targets that were previously judged too costly. That incremental shift has ripple effects. Longer sustained pressure on enemy industry, more experience accrued to refine tactics, and the eventual erosion of the defense in depth that had protected key facilities. But every advantage comes at cost. Roll drop also introduced risks that commanders worried about, and for good reason. Rolling an aircraft a few degrees out of alignment within a compact formation can result in collisions if poorly timed. It can create gaps in defensive fire sectors, exposing nearby planes to fighters. It can reduce the accuracy of certain kinds of attacks where pinpoint hits were essential, and it can produce political headaches if stray bombs hit civilian districts in ways that weren't authorized by planners. The moral geometry here is complex. Crews chose life over doctrine. Commanders fear the operational consequences of decentralized improvisation. The tension between the two underscores the broader wartime dilemma between control and adaptability. Engineers and ordnance officers sought to analyze the phenomenon with more formal rigor. Wind tunnel tests, mathematical modeling, and ballistics calculations explored how small attitude changes at release affected trajectory. Variables such as bomb weight, release altitude, drag coefficient, and airspeed were systematically considered. These analyses helped confirm what crews had reported anecdotally. Under certain conditions, a controlled roll could shift the impact pattern sufficiently to affect flak timing. They also identified conditions where the maneuver was counterproductive. This technical work allowed more informed decisions within units. Which targets were suitable for experimentation, the angles that yielded optimal displacement without risking structural stresses, and the interplay with enemy fuse types. The roll drop also prompted changes in how crews thought about coordination. Without official sanction, the maneuver relied on tacit communication and mutual trust. Bombardiers learned to read subtle cues in pilot control input. Pilots learned to modulate bank with surgical precision. flight engineers and navigators became better at predicting how a roll in their element would interact with the rest of the box. Over time, these small cultural shifts in practice made the technique safer and more reliable. What began as a lone improvisation evolved into a shared craft among crews who had the courage to test and the humility to learn from failure. The story of the roll drop is not merely a technical footnote. It is a narrative about human adaptation under pressure. It shows how frontline ingenuity can produce tactical change without official imprimatur, how survivability measures may ripple into strategic impact, and how the lived experience of war refines the relationship between doctrine and improvisation. In the end, the roll drop did not win the air war by itself, but exemplified the ways airmen sought any edge against an enemy that had learned to mathematize their predictability. Lives were saved, patterns were altered, doctrine flexed where necessity demanded, and history advanced in small, often unsanctioned moves. What remains after all the maps and numbers are the men who chose a tilt of the yoke over the strictures of doctrine, because the alternative was to accept certain death. They were not heroes in the loud, cinematic sense. They were pragmatic and frightened and brilliant in ways that only stress can produce. The roll drop is their quiet legacy, an example of how, in war as in life, a small change at the right moment can make all the difference. They began to notice the difference first not in statistics, but in sound. The old sound of a bomb run under heavy flak was unmistakable. The steady thunder of the engines, the sharp metallic clangs of fragments against aluminum, and the violent concussions that punched through the fuselage like hammers. When crews began to use the roll drop, there were missions where that familiar orchestra of destruction changed. There were still bursts, still explosions, but the rhythm felt wrong, out of sync. Bursts that should have been synchronous with the moment of release now came a heartbeat late. Bombardiers would watch through their sights and see black puffs blooming just behind where the plane had been, as if the air itself was missing its cue. That subtle shift, the difference between shells exploding behind you instead of around you, was something you felt before you dared to believe it. Those who survived and debriefed afterward found themselves describing sensations rather than numbers. A pilot might say, "The flak looks slower today," or "the bursts were chasing us." Engineers took those phrases and translated them into data points. They plotted average timing of bursts relative to formation speed and altitude and found slight but consistent mismatches that matched what a roll-induced vector change would produce. They saw enough correlation to conclude that something genuine was happening, even if it could not be replicated under laboratory conditions. It was field science born out of necessity. The German crews on the ground had their own language for what they were seeing. Some called it wandering spread. Reports mentioned formations that seemed to shift slightly in their bombing geometry, as if their center of gravity were fluid. The German gunners' confidence in their predictive tables began to erode in small but cumulative ways. When a mathematical system that depends on consistent input starts encountering inconsistent outcomes, operators begin doubting the model. That doubt slowed reaction times and forced more reliance on visual estimation. The result, ironically, was to make a highly rationalized system more human, and therefore less precise. Every time the airmen performed a roll drop, they did not just dodge a few shells. They chipped away at the psychological dominance that had made flak so fearsome. For the crews, though, it remained an act of nerve. A proper roll drop required a specific choreography that had to be executed in seconds. The pilot kept one eye on the horizon and one on the bomb run indicator, knowing that a fraction of an inch on the control column could mean the difference between a calculated roll and a chaotic tumble. The bombardier counted down through the bomb site, trusting the pilot to begin the roll at exactly the right moment. The engineer monitored instruments to ensure that fuel flow, oil pressure, and manifold temperature stayed within tolerance under the transient loads. It was a dance of confidence under conditions of extreme noise and fear. The entire maneuver lasted less than 5 seconds, but those seconds stretched into whole minutes in memory. What made the roll drop truly daring was that it invited failure on two fronts at once. If the pilot rolled too early or too far, the bomb pattern would scatter wide, defeating the mission's purpose. If he rolled too little, the deviation would be negligible, offering no protection. A misjudged roll could also throw the plane slightly out of formation, placing in the blind spot of a neighbor's defensive guns or in the path of a wingman's tail assembly. To the men attempting it, each run was an experiment with live variables and no repeatability. They learned through experience rather than instruction, tuning their instincts to the feedback of the sky. Over time, unofficial standards emerged. Veteran crews spoke of the 3-in-2 rule, no more than 3 degrees of roll for more than 2 seconds. That small deviation was enough to alter the bomb's departure vector without endangering structural integrity or formation cohesion. Some squadrons experimented with coordinated rolls, where the lead and his immediate wingman would all execute the maneuver simultaneously to maintain mutual coverage. These were the closest the roll drop came to institutional form, though they remained officially deniable. When debriefed, officers would couch their accounts in euphemisms like adjusted heading for wind compensation or minor evasive movement. Everyone knew what they meant. The engineers who studied the returning bombers after missions saw another side effect. Planes that performed roll drops tended to exhibit slightly different stress patterns on their wings and fuselages. The torsional loads from even mild rolls at high speed and full bomb load added cumulative strain to airframes. Maintenance crews began inspecting certain joints and spars more frequently, not because the maneuver was known by name, but because the damage signatures hinted at it. These technicians, without realizing it, became the physical record keepers of an unofficial tactic. What the roll drop achieved most profoundly was a shift in mindset. It reminded the airmen that even within the massive machinery of strategic bombing, there remained space for human agency. War at that altitude had begun to feel impersonal. Targets were grid squares, destruction was plotted in tons of ordnance, and life or death often seemed determined by statistics rather than will. The roll drop reintroduced uncertainty on terms that favored the living. It became a small act of rebellion against the cold logic of attrition. For every pilot who executed it successfully, there was a sense that he had briefly outwitted the industrial monster of war. The tactic's influence rippled quietly into other areas of aerial combat. Fighter-bomber units later adapted similar ideas in ground attack profiles, using slight rolls or banks during release to offset the aim of anti-aircraft guns. In the Pacific, where Japanese flak was lighter but more erratic, some Navy pilots applied roll principles to torpedo drops and dive bombing to confuse gunners. The underlying lesson was universal: predictability kills. By disrupting the enemy's expectation, even marginally, you reclaim initiative. The men who returned from missions with fewer holes in their fuselages carried the rumor home. They told replacement crews to never go down the same line twice, to twist her a little on the drop. It was coded speech that embedded the roll drop's logic into the folklore of air warfare. It no longer needed formal documentation. It survived in habit, in the muscle memory of those who trained the next wave. By the war's end, the skies over Europe are full of small, almost invisible deviations that together made the bomber force less of a target and more of a moving puzzle the enemy could not fully solve. When historians later try to reconstruct why flak effectiveness declined slightly in the final year of the war, they pointed to many factors: fuel shortages limiting practice, shortages of ammunition, disruptions in radar coverage, and declining morale among defenders. All of these were true, yet buried within the statistics was another cause: the learning curve of the bomber crews themselves. Adaptations like the roll drop, small in isolation but widespread in aggregate, changed the dynamics of engagement. The defenders were still dangerous, but they were no longer omniscient. In a war decided by cumulative marginal gains, that mattered. By the time peace returned, few of those who had flown with the technique spoke of it in grand terms. They remembered it not as a doctrine, but as an instinct, a reflex born in the tunnel of fate. Asked later why they had done it, most could not cite calculations or formal logic. They simply said it felt right, that when you could hear the flak getting closer, your hands would move on the controls almost by themselves. That small gesture, the twist of a yoke, and the will to survive, became part of the hidden grammar of how wars evolve. Innovation through fear, progress born from the refusal to die by the book. In the archives of air warfare, the roll drop sits like a ghost entry, barely named, rarely studied, but traceable in patterns of survivability and in the language of the men who flew. It stands as proof that even in the most mechanized form of battle, the human mind remained the most unpredictable weapon of all. They never gave a name at first. That was the strange thing. It wasn't invented in a laboratory, nor signed off by a colonel behind a mahogany desk. It just happened. One crew somewhere tried it out of desperation. Another copied what they'd heard through a garbled intercom from a plane 2 boxes over. Only later, when the mission started to last a little longer and the number of missing aircraft on the chalkboard began to shrink, did men start calling it something. They said, almost jokingly at first, the roll drop, as if it were a dance step. The word stuck because they were simple and felt like the motion itself. A twist and a release, quick and smooth, halfway between instinct and plan. The air war in Europe had reached its grinding middle phase by then. The defenders had turned the sky itself into an instrument of attrition. Each German city ringed with batteries, each approach corridor calculated by thousands of men who knew the bombers' habits. The Allies had improved formation tactics and escort coverage, but Flak remained the one opponent you could not see, reason with, or outrun. It waited at every altitude, indifferent to bravery. That was the world the roll drop entered, a world choking on procedure and death lists. Those who practiced it learned the subtleties that textbooks never could have captured. A roll could not begin too soon, or the bomb site would drift. It could not come too late, or the aircraft would already be inside the barrage. Pilots spoke of finding the sweet second, the moment when the bomb site picture froze in a way that told the bombardier the vectors had aligned, just before the Flak predictor's timing came due. That second was the border between discipline and improvisation. The pilot would tilt his wrist, the wings would cant, and the entire weight of the loaded bomber would answer like a living thing. The bombardier, feeling the shift through his harness, would press the release. Gravity would take over, and for a few heartbeats the crew waited for the verdict. Sometimes there was the brutal slap of nearby bursts, sometimes only the long, blessed silence of altitude. No two crews did it identically. Some preferred a gentle bank right. Others favored a quick left roll that used the torque of the propellers to steady the motion. A few experimented with alternating rolls, releasing bombs in small strings that traced a pattern across the target area. The latter method often scattered impacts too widely to please the analysts on the ground. But when those same analysts noticed fewer aircraft lost, complaints softened. The secret of survival has a way of rewriting doctrine without ever filing a memo. It is hard to measure precisely how many lives the technique saved, but fragments of evidence suggest its reach. In the last year of the European campaign, Flak accounted for a smaller percentage of bomber losses despite heavier concentrations of guns around key industrial zones. Maintenance crews found fewer instances of shrapnel damage in certain groups known for aggressive evasive release, the euphemism that appeared in logs. Declassified engineering reports decades later confirmed that the average deviation in bomb impact points from those same groups was slightly higher than the theoretical dispersion of Norton-guided drops, proof of altered release dynamics. Accuracy had dipped, yes, but survivability had improved. In total war, that is a trade feud question. Inside the aircraft, the emotional effect mattered just as much as the statistics. To roll, even slightly, was to act, to do something rather than wait passively for fate. Crews spoke of the psychological release, the feeling that they could fight back against the invisible enemy. That morale boost, intangible but real, carried many through the long months of attrition. For once, the bomber was not just a target. It was a moving equation with an answer the enemy could not quite solve. There were, inevitably, skeptics. Some higher officers warned that any deviation from standard procedure risked compromising the formation's integrity. They worried that if every crew began improvising, the carefully engineered geometry of mutual defense would collapse. To their credit, they were not entirely wrong. A few near collisions did occur when less experienced pilots attempted rolls without coordination. Those incidents became cautionary tales whispered among crews, reminders that courage without control could kill as surely as flak. Yet even those mishaps could not erase the growing conviction among veterans that the maneuver, when executed properly, worked. As 1945 approached, the technique matured into something almost ritualistic. Crews would brief quietly before takeoff, acknowledging it with a glance rather than a sentence. "We'll give her the twist," a pilot might say, and the bombardier would nod. No more explanation was needed. The younger men, freshly arrived from stateside training, learned it by imitation, copying the body language of veterans during practice runs. In this way, the roll drop became an oral tradition of the air, transmitted not by orders, but by muscle memory. When the war ended and the bombers came home, the maneuver faded from official conversation. The Air Force of the Cold War era preferred clean doctrines and replicable procedures. The messy improvisations of wartime seemed almost embarrassing in hindsight. The roll drop survived only in recollections, memoirs, and the aging gestures of men who still, when describing a mission, would unconsciously tilt their hand in the air to mimic the roll. Historians, sifting through mission footage decades later, noticed subtle banks in some film reels that did not match the scripted flight patterns, small visual ghosts of the maneuver living on in black and white. The idea itself never died. Modern strike pilots, when studying historical tactics, recognize the same principle in their own discipline: the power of unpredictability. Guided bombs and computers may have replaced the Norden sight, but the lesson remains identical. Never give the enemy an easy equation to solve. The roll drop, born in the roar of piston engines and the stink of fear, became one of the earliest demonstrations of that truth. Looking back, it is tempting to romanticize the maneuver, to see in it a symbol of defiance or genius. The men who performed it would have rejected that label. They saw it as nothing more than common sense. They had watched too many of their friends vanish in symmetrical fireballs to keep doing everything by the book. If a small tilt of the wings and a fraction of timing could bend the odds, then that was what they would do. History, in the end, is built from such small acts, the moments when individuals, facing annihilation, find room to move inside the machinery that was supposed to define them. And so, in a long chain of evolution that turned early, lumbering bombers into the precision strike aircraft of later generations, the roll drop sits quietly at the beginning. It was not technology, but imagination that made it possible. A man looked at a set of rules written in the comfort of safety and decided to test them against reality. That is the real secret behind how bombs began to sneak past Flak. Not the physics of the roll itself, but the human refusal to be predictable. The winter of 1944 froze the continent, and the war into a kind of pause between horrors. Over Germany, the air was so cold that exhaust from the engines formed white spears stretching for miles. From the ground, those contrails marked the paths of the formations like chalk lines drawn across the heavens, and the gunners used them the way a hunter reads tracks in the snow. Inside the planes, the men wore electric suits under their uniforms, fingers stiff even before the frost crept in through the seams of their gloves. They had learned by then that courage had a rhythm. It rose with the drone of the engines, dipped when the flak started, steadied when they found the small rituals that made danger tolerable. Among those rituals, the roll drop had become second nature. It was no longer a debate about whether to risk it. It was now as much a part of the bomb run as opening the bay doors. The crews no longer even announced it over the intercom. Everyone felt the motion, knew the count. To an outside observer, the plane still appeared steady, the formation unbroken. Only the men inside felt the subtle twist as the pilot banked, the momentary shift of gravity, the way the horizon tilted like a hand guiding fate just slightly off its mark. After each mission, the crews would gather in the briefing huts, faces red from windburn and exhaustion. They'd unstrap their parachutes, light cigarettes with shaking hands, and wait for the intelligence officer to ask for reports. Most stuck to the script: weather, fighter resistance, bomb pattern, flak density. A few slipped in small phrases that meant more than they looked. Burst behind us this time. Timing seemed off for the guns. Bombs walked a bit long, sir. The officers nodded, took notes, and moved on. The system preferred its miracles unrecorded. Down in the maintenance bays, the evidence was more concrete. Planes that had rolled during release showed uneven soot patterns on their wings where hot gases had brushed the metal differently, rivets worn at asymmetric angles, and sometimes a faint warping in the bomb bay doors that told of stress. The ground crews recognized these marks before anyone admitted what caused them. They began to keep spare panels on hand, quietly calling them twisters. When someone asked about them on an inspection tour, the sergeants only shrugged. Routine wear, sir. As winter turned to the desperate spring of 1945, the German defenses began to fracture. Fuel shortages kept many flak batteries silent, but those that remained still fought with frightening precision. Over targets like Dresden and the Ruhr Valley, the sky could still light up with bursting steel. Yet in many missions, the flak failed to connect as cleanly as it once had. German after-action reports complained of bombers dropping erratically or releasing at unanticipated intervals. The mathematicians who had built the predictive tables could not reconcile the data. The sky had become inconsistent. In that inconsistency lay the quiet success of the roll drop. It had never promised immunity. No one in those bombers believed in that. What it gave was uncertainty, and uncertainty is a weapon of its own. If the defenders could not predict the pattern, they could not perfect their aim. Every shell that burst a second too late, every plume of shrapnel that exploded in empty air, was time won and distance gained. Survival was measured not in absolutes, but in margins. The story spread even beyond Europe. American airmen transferred to the Pacific carried the habit with them, teaching it to crews flying over Japanese defenses. There the enemy's flak was lighter but quicker, often fire by sight rather than computation. The same principle applied. A sudden, slight roll during the attack run made it harder for gunners to track, harder for shells to meet their targets. The maneuver became a kind of universal language among those who flew against ground fire, a whisper from one war zone to another. After the war, the official histories moved on quickly. The roll drop was never codified, never named in manuals. When the Air Force became an independent service, its new textbooks were full of diagrams and equations, not anecdotes of improvisation. Yet the essence of the maneuver lingered. In later conflicts, when jet pilots learned to jink during missile attacks or to offset their attack vectors by unpredictable margins, they were following the same logic born above Europe. The machines had changed, but the principle had not. Never give your enemy a straight line to aim at. For the men who had lived it, the memory of that motion remained vivid long after the details of missions faded. Old pilots, decades later, would describe the sensation with their hands, a small tilt, a pause, then a leveling out, as if their bodies remembered better than their words. To them, the roll drop was not a theory, but a feeling, the moment when fear and control met. It was the fraction of a second when you could feel the world tipping one way and you were pushing the other. Many of those men never spoke about it publicly. Some feared that admitting to unsanctioned maneuvers might sound like an accusation against those who had obeyed the rules and died. Others simply felt that explaining it would cheapen what had been, at its heart, a personal decision made under fire. The history of air war is often written in tonnage and coordinates, but behind those statistics lie gestures too small for reports. The turn of a wrist, the shared glance between a pilot and a bombardier, the silent agreement that rules were worth breaking if they kept men alive. When the last of the old bombers were retired and parked in museums, the roll drop became invisible again, hidden beneath layers of restoration paint. Visitors walking under their wings might admire the scale, the symmetry, the power. They would not see the memory of that tiny roll, that breath of rebellion against inevitability, etched into the metal. But for those who had once felt the sky tilt around them, it was there, as real as the smell of oil and cordite, as real as the faces that never came back. The secret of the roll drop was never that it was complex. It was that it required trust between the pilot who risked his plane, the bombardier who altered his aim, and the crew who believed that somewhere in that small act of defiance lay a path through the storm. They did not name it to hide it from the enemy. They left it unnamed because it belonged to them alone, to the narrow line between death and return that only those who flew could understand. And in that narrow line, the war's vast machinery briefly became human again. When the noise finally stopped, when the last missions were flown and the sky was no longer black with smoke, the world below began to measure what had been won and what it had cost. The cities lay in ruins, and the airfields that had once thrummed with engines fell quiet. In that silence, the men who had lived inside the bombers had to learn how to be ordinary again. For most of them, the war remained a sequence of sensations. The The taste of rubber in the oxygen mask, the vibration through the seat as the engines reached full power, the sudden lift when the plane broke through cloud and sunlight spilled through the nose glass. They remembered the missions not by dates, but by sounds and movements. Somewhere in that archive of muscle memory was the roll drop, the small, practiced motion that had become as natural as breathing. It had been born out of the worst conditions imaginable, and now, in peace, it existed only as a kind of muscle twitch whenever they spoke about those years. The pilot's hand would tilt unconsciously. The bombardier's eyes would track an invisible horizon. They no longer needed to explain the maneuver to anyone. They understood it as something private, an unspoken agreement that courage had to be clever, that survival sometimes depended on being just a little less predictable than death expected. The official histories that followed never found a place for it. They spoke in the language of tonnage and strategy, of campaigns and yields, of theories tested and improved. They preferred clean diagrams and statistics to the messy truths of how people actually fought. And perhaps that was fitting. The roll drop was never about technology. It was about refusal. It was a human answer to a mechanical problem, a reminder that no matter how industrial war becomes, it is still waged by individuals trying to outthink the inevitable. In the quiet years that followed, when memorials went up and the public sought heroes to fill them, the men who had twisted their bombers through Flak corridors rarely volunteered to stand at the front. They had no medals for what they'd done, no orders citing their initiative. Their victory was measured in the lives that continued after the engines cut out, the wives and children, the ordinary mornings, the slow return to peace. The roll drop was their insurance policy, their unacknowledged contribution to survival. And yet, in subtle ways, its legacy persisted. The next generation of pilots inherited the lesson without knowing its origin. Flight instructors spoke of breaking symmetry, of never flying a perfect line into a threat. Jet pilots, missile operators, even the designers of unmanned craft built unpredictability into their programming. The principle that had once saved a few bombers over Schweinfurt became a foundation of modern air combat. The understanding that precision must always coexist with variance, that the perfect line is also the most vulnerable. When veterans did speak of those days, usually to younger men or to their grandchildren, their stories often ended the same way. They would describe the light through the canopy, the sound of the flak growing closer, the feeling of the plane trembling, and then, almost as an afterthought, the roll. Just a little twist, they'd say, just enough to fool the sky. To the listeners, it sounded like poetry. To the men who'd lived it, it was geometry and faith intertwined. So the secret roll drop, the small defiance that had sneaked bombs past Flak, faded not into obscurity, but into essence. It became one of those invisible threads running through the history of flight, a whisper that told every generation that there is always one more variable left to change, even when the equation looks complete. Somewhere, in the museum silence beneath the hanging bombers, a visitor might catch a glimpse of it without knowing what they see. The faint asymmetry of a wings where the ghost of emotion preserved in metal. The planes rest now, perfect and still, but once in the thin air of war they rolled, just slightly, just enough, to let life slip past the mathematics of destruction. And in that narrow margin, the men who flew them proved that even in a war built on calculation, the final measure of victory belonged to the unpredictable courage of human hands.